Welcome to Habeas Treasures, where I try to decipher this book, There's Treasure Inside by Jon Collins-Black, in order to find one of the 5 hidden treasures. On today's episode, I'll continue my breakdown of the Pokemon Box chapter and investigate whether there are any supporting clues to be found in part 1 of the book. Let's begin! Let me first start out by taking a moment to briefly summarize my Pokemon Box solve. If you've watched my previous videos, then you know I think the Pokemon Box is hidden somewhere near the statue of Saint Ignatius, just west of the West Baden Springs Hotel near French Lick, Indiana. These are some of the clues that led me there. First, by analyzing the missing and added features of the Froakie Greninja images in the chapter, I came up with the towns of French Lick and West Baden as a starting point, which are located just a mile apart from one another in southern Indiana. Those 2 towns are located along the original Buffalo Trace, which is supported in the story by the Bouffalant Pokemon and the word modicum mentioned in the chapter. Finally, there are a lot of clues that appear to relate to the former Jesuit seminary that used to operate out of the West Baden Springs Hotel property. Clues like the founder of the Jesuits was Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and the name Ignatius in Latin means fiery one or fire, which ties into the no fire Pokemon lines in the story. Also, the celebration of St. Ignatius takes place each year on July 31st, the exact middle of high summer, when the author states he hid the treasure. The mention of the Jaco brand camper at the beginning could be a reference to the original name of the Jesuits, Compañía de Jesús, or Company of Jesus, or Jaco, as it could be abbreviated. Also, the word Loyola means, quote, the muddy place, which might be why the author sees Mudkip and Swampert Pokemon, since their natural habitat is the mud. And similarly, the line warmed my spirits could refer to the spiritual exercises that St. Ignatius created, because what better way to warm your spirit up than through exercise? Also, the word for a family of raccoons, like the author sees, is called a nursery. And the Latin word for seminary, like the Jesuit seminary at West Baden, is seminarium, which also means plant nursery. Anyway, in my previous videos, I go into lots more detail about these connections and the other reasons why I think the author is directing us to French Lick, the West Baden Springs Hotel, and most importantly, the statue of St. Ignatius to find the treasure. But the purpose of this video is to explore if any other chapters in the book might add something to this solve. Now, I realize there's a lot of debate and controversy about whether information in part 1 of the book should be used to solve the part 2 treasure hunts. The author explicitly writes that the 4 chapters in part 2 of this book contain primarily all you need to discover the location of the other 4 treasure boxes. So it may be that all of this is just a waste of time, but it's fun, so I'm going to do it anyway. Now, before I get into the part 1 details, let me start out by saying that I arrived at my solve for the Pokemon box first without any of this additional information. However, once I started rereading part 1 of the book with the solve in mind, I began encountering possible clues that I thought were interesting. We'll call those coincidences. The first coincidence I discovered was in chapter 21, the Antiquities of Alexander. The passage that really stood out to me in this chapter was, if you've been thoughtful, you may have considered that a chapter titled Make It Make Sense might also be a reference to figuring out the solution for the location of the treasure I have hidden. My hope is that this chapter can help you do just that. But you might have to look beyond just ancient myths and legends and consider more. Both the French Lick and West Baden Springs hotels are heavily steeped in Roman mythology. What made the 2 hotels famous in the early 1900s was the spring water that bubbled up from an underground river called the Lost River. Both hotels bottled the water and sold it to customers touting its healing properties for many years, until the FDA discovered high levels of lithium in the water and shut them down. The hotels used Roman mythology to market the spring water. The French Lick Hotel called their water Pluto water after the Roman god of the underworld, and the West Baden Springs Hotel named their springs after gods as well, Hygeia, Apollo, and Neptune. Now, I don't think the treasure is hidden near any of the springs that are on hotel property. However, it's interesting to me that the author wrote, but you might have to look beyond just ancient myths and legends and consider more. Specifically, the consider more phrase. Now, in Jesuit teaching, there's a famous core principle called magis, meaning more. The Jesuits believe one should always strive to do more to discover the true you. So, if you put this line from the Antiquities of Alexander chapter in the context of the West Baden Springs Hotel Pokemon box solve, it's easy to come to the conclusion that what the author might be indicating is that we should look beyond the springs named after the Roman gods and legends and consider more the area near the Saint Ignatius Jesuit statue. Now, what makes this passage even a stranger coincidence is that it starts off referencing the subtitle of the chapter, Make It Make Sense. This reminded me of the line in the Pokemon box story where the author writes, oddly, only one picture was preserved well enough to make any sense out of it. Now, in an earlier video, I explained that I thought the author could be using this line in the Pokemon box story to refer to the Hygeia spring at the West Baden Springs Hotel. The hotel labeled their springs using only odd numbers, and the Hygeia spring was spring number 1. Also, it was the only spring that was fully preserved in the hotel restoration. Here, listen to this clip that explains the restoration process of the spring.
The outbuildings have all been restored on the exterior but left as is on the interior, with the exception of Hygeia, one of the Springs buildings, and that was a slightly more elaborate tiled and building with stained glass windows, so that building, the interior was restored as well.
So it's possible that the author is indicating that the Hygeia spring is a clue, but that to find the treasure, we have to look beyond the myths and legends and consider more. The more being, as I stated earlier, the area around the Jesuit statue of Saint Ignatius that ties to the word magus. To drive this point home further, let's look at the Amelia Earhart chapter in part 1 of the book. Notice the subtitle, Explore More. Is this another coincidence, perhaps? Or is the author trying to make the Jesuit connection once again? Now, let's look at chapter 5 in the book, The Masterworks by Art Smith. The subtitle of this chapter is An Exercise in Faith. Is this another reference to the Jesuit faith and the famous spiritual exercises created by St. Ignatius, or just another coincidence? What's particularly interesting to me about this chapter is the quote at the beginning by Martin Luther King Jr. It reads, "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase." In my last video, I explained how I think the author is using the lines, "We reverse course and we circle back," to direct us out of the golf course exit at the rear of the West Baden Springs Hotel to find the treasure. The sign above this exit is shown here. Notice how the U in the word course has been turned into a V. Well, another way of saying we reverse course is we made a U-turn. In this case, they turned a U into a V. And I think this could be also why the Greninja has a V drawn on its chest. Anyway, the other thing I mentioned in that video is that if you were a guest in the hotel during the early 1900s, you could leave the hotel out of this back exit and climb the 100 steps up to the Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church. Now, the church was demolished in 1934, but was eventually replaced by the statue of St. Ignatius that's still there today. Now, the steps leading up to the former church are in ruins and are barely visible today. And maybe this is why the author included the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, "Faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase." Now, the other part 1 chapter that seems like it could have a direct bearing on the Pokemon box is chapter 3, titled A Puzzle Box, a Magnifying Glass, and the Mysterious Egg. Some of these connections are more obvious. For instance, this chapter includes details about Japanese puzzle boxes, just like the Japanese puzzle box shown in the Pokemon box chapter. And Hakone, the place in Japan where the puzzle boxes are made, is also famous for its hot springs, similar to the sulfur springs that made French Lick famous. Also, chapter 3 tells the story of the famous Fabergé jewelry designer Michael Birkin and the legendary Fabergé egg that was discovered in 2012. And of course, the Pokemon box chapter features another Fabergé item, the Fabergé Natsuki frog. But there are also some more subtle connections. For instance, let's look at the quotes that begin the chapter. The first is from a French photographer, Henri Cartier-Bresson. And there are multiple French mentions in the Pokemon box chapter, and of course, potentially the ultimate French connection is the town of French Lick. But there's also the parallel of using a photographer's quote in this chapter when the final clue in the Pokemon chapter is an overexposed photograph. How about the other quote by Gosho Aoyama? He's a Japanese manga artist, most famous for his Case Closed series featuring Detective Conan. This reminded me of another famous Conan mentioned in the chapter in a roundabout sort of way, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. You may remember that chapter 3 includes this line, "In the spirit of playfulness, I thought it only appropriate to include a magnifying glass in our treasure, a Sherlock Holmesian symbol reminding us of the importance of paying attention to the smallest things." This line shares some of the same wording as the line in the Pokemon box chapter about the Mudkip and Swampert that reads, Their playful, gliding movements warmed my spirits. And remember how earlier in the video I connected the Mudkip and Swampert and the warmed my spirits line to Saint Ignatius and the Jesuits? Well, it turns out that Sherlock Holmes can also be linked to the Jesuits because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's full name is actually, believe it or not, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle. And one final coincidence. The author begins the Antiquities of Alexander chapter with a photograph showing a mirrored image of the apotheosis of Hercules. I've covered in my videos before that I believe the Pokemon Box chapter is a mirrored story where the first part in New Orleans is a reflection of the second part with the Froki. But the other reason I think the author includes the apotheosis of Hercules is there's another famous ceiling painting called the Apotheosis of Ignatius. It's located in the church of Saint Ignazio in Rome and features Saint Ignatius of Loyola being welcomed into heaven in a very similar manner as the Hercules painting. But the main difference is it's famous for being painted as an optical illusion. And when you stand at the center of the church and look up, it appears as if the image extends into the heavens, even though the ceiling is actually flat. Now, if you don't want to hurt your neck by looking up, the church has installed a mirror on the floor that allows you to see the reflected image. Could this be why the author shows the mirrored image of the apotheosis of Hercules in the book? That makes sense to me. And also, it could be why I think the overexposed photograph at the end of the Pokemon Box chapter will likely turn out to be an optical illusion, like the Ignatius painting possibly created using a mirror. Anyway, that's all I've got for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed my breakdown of the Pokemon Box. Good luck on your hunt. Stay safe out there.